Welcome to the EU VAT module. So my name is Jeanette Maxwell. I'm an indirect tax director in Grant Thornton. So I'm going to be taking you through the EU VAT module, and I'm delighted to be able to do so. So looking forward to doing this series of recordings, and then on our various live Zoom days, I can address any questions that you have and recap any additional topics that you find a little tricky. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll kick off with our module then. So for weeks 1 and 2, we're going to be looking at some fundamental concepts. And if you've had a chance to look through the exam papers, or perhaps it's a little bit too early, you will notice that there is quite a focus on these fundamental concepts in the papers. So it's 15% of the course, and it does crop up as a 15 or a 20 marker in the exam, usually as a sort of a question that you have to explain your understanding of the topic, as opposed to in a bit of a case study type scenario. So very important that we get to grasp with these early on in the course. So what we're going to look at today then, we're going to look at the sources of law. And then we're going to make a start on EU law principles, and then we'll finish the rest of those then in week 2. So sources of law then. So I suppose at the very beginning, in a historical concept, EU VAT, where does this arise from and what's the obligation? So on joining the EU, the member states have to operate VAT in a similar fashion, and that means taking their lead from the EU. So the whole point of VAT being an EU-wide tax is the aim is to have uniformity and to have it streamlined across all EU member states, so that a VAT registered business that's carrying on an activity in Ireland, France, Germany and Spain, that when they go to seek advice or they go to apply the VAT rules, that they would be similar across all jurisdictions, so that they can expect the approach that particular member state is going to take. Of course, that's not always the case. The EU VAT directive will impose certain boundaries upon which the member states will act, but then there are certain domestic rules then that will interact with the EU VAT principle, and that's up to the member states' discretion as to how they actually invoke those. But the overarching aim then of having an EU-wide tax such as VAT is that there is a harmonised approach and uniformity across all member states. And unless a member state has a particular derogation, it must implement the rules contained within the EU legislation. Okay, so it's bound by its EU membership to do that. So what does a derogation really mean? Well, it means that the member state is seeking permission from the EU to delegate from or derogate from a particular rule that's there already. So the EU can force member states to amend its VAT laws to bring them in line with the EU VAT directive if they haven't got this derogation. So let's say in an Irish example, Ireland had initially treated charging VAT on charging VAT on toll bridges. Ireland had treated these as VAT exempt lettings. But because Ireland didn't have a particular derogation in order to do that, the EU forced Ireland then to change its VAT law so that they had to charge VAT on the toll bridges. They could no longer treat them as a VAT exempt letting. So that, I suppose, shows the supremacy of EU VAT law on the domestic law of the member states, that they have to abide by the rules unless they have a particular derogation. So what's the legal basis for VAT? So why do member states have to have these various rules and have to abide by the EU laws? Well, it's contained in the TFEU. And just for those of you that may not be familiar with that, that's one of 2 treaties that forms the constitutional basis of the EU. So why the EU exists. So the TFEU stands for Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And the other treaty then is the Treaty on the European Union, or the TEU, commonly known as the TEC before it was the TEU. And we'll be referring to those throughout the course. So as I always say, you know, when I'm lecturing, we always have to go back. Where does it say that in the written document? You know, where is that substantiated? Where is that written down? So the legal basis for VAT, Article 113. So the Council shall, acting unanimously, in accordance with a special legislative procedure, and after consulting the European Parliament and Economic and Social Committee, adopt provisions for the harmonisation of legislation concerning turnover taxes, excise duties and other forms of indirect taxation to the extent that such harmonisation is necessary to ensure the establishment and the functioning of the internal market and to avoid distortion of competition. So there's a lot within that. It explains what it applies to. So you'll know in other countries, like let's say in America, we have, you know, GST, goods and services tax, turnover taxes. In the EU, we call VAT indirect tax or VAT. We also have excise duties. So their indirect taxes are on consumption. They're not taxes on transactions, they're taxes on consumption. And this article in the TFEU also gives us the, I suppose, the reason for it. So the purpose is to ensure the functioning of the internal market and to avoid the distortion of competition as well.